Hello everybody, welcome to the second review video for the functionality program, and in this video we're actually going to focus primarily on loops. So we talked about two types of loops in booklet 4, for loops and while loops, and so we'll talk about how both of those are implemented in real code, and we'll work through some basic examples just to improve our familiarity with them. Now, you should have the previous REBL open from video 1, and this is just some of the code that we had written there. Now, if you want to leave this code in, but you don't want it to execute, you can do something that's called a comment. So all coding languages have a way where you can put comments in code, and so those are essentially what we call a comment is anything that is in the script but doesn't actually run. It's not executed. And so you can go ahead and, in case you're in edit mode, you can go and refresh the page. But there's two types of comments in Python. There's inline or single line comments, and then there's multi-line comments. So we have actually been using single line comments in the booklets, and those are just denoted like this. So you'll see how everything gets grayed out on that line, but nothing else. So if I were to run this, my list would not be created. But since we have multiple lines, we can actually use triple quotes. So if you take single or double quotes and you just put 3 of them, so let's do single, 1, 2, 3, you can see how all of it turns to red. And then you can go ahead and do 3 to close it. And so this is also something you could call it a multi-line string, but since I just leave it like this, the Python doesn't really execute it or anything, it just treats it as a string and we don't have to worry about it. So now we can start writing our actual code. So the first loop we'll talk about is the while loop. And so while loops, as we talked about earlier in the program and in the booklet, are used to execute some piece of code as long as a condition is true. And so the most common conditions are while some variable is less than a number. And so this means you will initialize a variable, maybe you'll say it's called counter, and you would say it's equal to 0. And then if you want to run the code 5 times, you would say while counter is less than 5, and you would update counter each time you run the statements in the loop. So you do plus equals 1. And so plus equals, if you remember, is an operator that adds 1 to the value of the variable. And so the first time counter will be 0, and then it will run everything in here. Then it will become 1, it will run everything, 2, so on. And then once counter is 5, it will no longer satisfy this condition, and it will exit the loop. And so the general syntax you can kind of see here. We have the while, obviously the word. We have our condition, and then we have a colon. Then everything within the loop is indented, similar to a function. So that's how all Python syntax is. There's no parentheses or anything like that. And this is the most traditional approach to while loops. There are other ways, there's other conditions obviously, and that would obviously be based on situation. But traditionally, this type of counter variable, you can name it whatever you want, updater, and you just run it as many times as you need that set of statements to run. So one of the things we can do with a while loop is if we want to maybe display a greeting to the user, and we want to display it multiple times. If we want to generate, new numbers and display those, really anytime you want to do something in succession over and over again, you'll use a while loop. So if we were to just put a basic statement in here, print hello, like that, and we run this code, let's see what we get. We get hello printed out 5 times. And so that's what we expected. We expected the code to run 5 times, and each time it printed hello. So we've also seen something else, which are the while true loops. And so those are used to just run code infinitely. Now, it's important with the while true loop is that you have some type of break statement. So often in a while true loop, you'll have some code, and then you'll have an if statement within it. And so if condition is met, then you'll break. And break is used in both types of loops. It's used to exit the loop completely. Now, one of the cool things we can do here with a traditional loop is we can use a continue statement. So let's say we want to print hello, but if counter is equal to 3, we don't want to print hello. We want to skip to counter being 4. So one of the issues we might run into is if we try something like this. If counter is equal to 3, remember we need 2 equal signs to compare, we could do something like continue, like this. Now, this might look right, so we're doing the same process, counter 0, and once it hits 3, we continue, but let's try to run this and see what happens. You can see our code never stopped executing. It's stuck, and it printed out hello 3 times, but it's not done anything after that. And the reason is that REPL has sort of a built-in check against infinite loops. And so infinite loops are something you need to be very careful about with while loops specifically, because if the condition is not being ever satisfied, the code will never exit the loop. So here the issue is that, let's say we start at 0, like we are, then it prints hello 1 time, now we're at 1, prints hello again, we're at 2, then it prints hello again, and now we're at 3. Now we enter the loop, if counter equals 3, we continue, which means we go to the next iteration. But it means we skip every other statement after the continue within the loop. And so the issue becomes that counter never actually gets updated, because each time we do 3 is equal to 3, we continue, we skip lines 20 and 21. So the natural remedy to this would be to copy this line, counter plus equals 1, remove it from here, and then put it up here. Make sure it's indented only one block in. Now I'll delete the 0, 1, 2, 3 I wrote down there. If I run it now, you see I get 4 hellos printed because when counter was 3, I continued. I didn't print hello. So continue can be used in while loops and for loops. Break can also be used. So break completely exits the loop. Continue just skips to the next iteration. It skips the rest of the lines and goes back into the loop. The important thing to note is that while loops need to have an exit point. If you do something like while true and you have no break within it, the code will just continue running forever and your program will hang. It will not be able to exit. That's essentially the basics of while loops. Obviously, we could have a lot more lines in there depending on what we're trying to do. But what's important right now is to understand the syntax, understand a condition statement, and understand how we update some type of parameter to make sure that the condition is met eventually. Now let's move to for loops. For loops are a little bit different because they're actually used to go over the elements of some type of iterable, like a list, a string. We'll talk about some more intricate data classes eventually, but those are primarily the two types we use them for. So let's just define a list, my list, which we had up there, but let's just make a new one. And we can do the same thing, just a few names maybe. So we'll just do a few common names in here. And I'll just do my name, although it is probably not common here. And what if we wanted to go over each of these names and say something like hello and then the name? Now, we could obviously hard code that. We could say hello John, hello Grace, hello Rohan, or we could just iterate over the list. And so to do that, we would do something like this: for var in iterable. So this is something we talked about in the booklet and the program. So our iterable is any type of list, so we can replace it with my list. Sorry. And we can change var to whatever we want, each element to be called in the loop. So we can do something like maybe name. So keep in mind that in the while loop, we had to declare our variable involved in our condition beforehand. Here, we don't. So the name is just used, and the loop will know what name means, and it's going to take on each of these values. So for starters, let's just try printing the name. So just for name in my list, print name. If you run this, you'll get John, Grace, and Rohan, each on a new line. So it's just the name is taking the value in the list one by one. So now we want to print something maybe a little bit more personalized, something like hello, because these are obviously names. So what we could do is create a variable called greeting, and we would set that equal to the string hello with a space at the end plus name. So the reason I have this space is when we do string addition, it just smashes the strings together. And so we don't want it to say hello John with no spaces, we want it to say hello space John. So now if we try to print this greeting, we'll see hello John, hello Grace, and hello Rohan. And so you can see that we're just going over the elements of the list, and one of the cool things is that we don't need to worry about getting stuck in a loop, because the list obviously has a finite number of elements, so we will exit at some point. Now, as we talked about, break and continue can be used in the same way. So maybe we don't want to say hello to Grace. So if you do if name equals Grace, we can just do a continue. So this will not print hello Grace because it will skip the rest of the lines when name is Grace. So if I run this, I'll get hello John, hello Rohan. Now if I don't want to do anything after Grace either, then instead of continue, I could do break. When I run this, get hello John. So it's really very straightforward. The break and continue, they operate the same way in either loop. The main thing is to understand that we have a variable name which we choose, can be whatever you want. Then we have some type of iterable which we have to create obviously. And then we can put our code inside of here. And the if statement we have not talked about in depth, but it's very basic, it's very straightforward. If something is true, then we execute code, and else we just continue. And it still uses the same colon format, and within the if statement, all the code within it is indented one block over. Now, we did talk about the enumerate function in this program in module 2, and so I want to spend a little bit of time on that. So let's create another list, new list equals, and let's just do a few numbers, so 3, 5, 7. Okay, now what if we wanted to not only get the value, but we also wanted to get the index, like if we want to do indexing or assignment? Well, we can wrap this in what's called enumerate. So we'll obviously have to change this to new list. And so enumerate's basically just a built-in function. We call it like a function. Its name is enumerate, and then we give it an argument, which is an iterable new list. But then here we're going to change this. We're going to get idx, and we can change our variable to value. Now we have two variables. We have idx, which is short for index. It's very commonly used in coding, and value. And so obviously you can rename these to whatever you want for idx number, for index number. That's really personal preference. But I like to do idx and value. So what this gives us is it gives us both the location and the value, as I said. So let's just try printing out both of these variables right now. Print idx, print value. If I run this, I get 0, 3, 1, 5, 2, 7. So 0 is my index, because indexing starts at 0, and then my first value is 3. Then my index is 1, my next value is 5. Then my index is finally 2, and my last value is 7. So this gives us an easy way to access both the index and the value. Now let's say we want to add some value to each item in the list. An easy way to do this is we have the value already in the value variable. We can do changed is the new variable name. Do value plus 5. Let's say we want to add 5 to everything. Now, if we just did a traditional for loop, like for value in new list, we wouldn't know what position we're on. But here we can use the index to actually change it. So we can do new list. Remember, indexing is done with the index number in square brackets. In this case, our index is stored in the idx variable. You can do changed. So this will go over the list and change each one. Then, if we print new list and run this, see 8, 10, 12. So 3 plus 5 is 8, 5 plus 5 is 10, and 7 plus 5 is 12. So essentially what we've been able to do is not only access a value, we've been able to alter it and then update the list directly in the loop. And so that's what for loops are commonly used for. And on the other hand, while loops are obviously used to just run something a specific number of times. Either way, both the loops follow very similar structures in terms of colon, putting the indentation for all the code within them, and they also obviously use some type of condition. The for loop really uses once it's at the end of the iterable, it exits, while the while loop uses a more manual condition. But you can use break, you can use continue, and they're both used to execute code multiple times in a row.